How was your journey?
Many machines on X.
One of the most integral parts of the Dune-iverse is the fact that interstellar travel is as close to instantaneous as it gets. Technology is one of the fundamental considerations every novelist has to grapple with when creating their fictional worlds. Fantasy can get away with stranding its characters in medieval settings, but science fiction requires technological advancement as a baseline consideration. Herbert found a great way of circumventing the need to get into complex machine language by making his world society live in the Middle Ages while having technology that far surpasses anything we possess, and the crowning jewel of this circumvention was the Spacing Guild. The Guild is the only organization in the Imperium that makes faster-than-light travel safe, and their existence is so embedded within the fabric of the Dune-iverse that the Imperial calendar begins with their day of incorporation. But why did the Spacing Guild come into existence? How did it turn into the political juggernaut that it was before the time of Muad'Dib? And what happened to its monopoly over space travel in the long run? In this video, we'll address all those factors and more, so without further ado, this is the entire 15,000 plus year life of the Spacing Guild explored. Before we get into our explanation though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. How humans traveled through space before the Guild and why it was needed. Before we get too deep into this video, we want to make a few things clear. A lot of our information is going to be a mix of details from the original Dune novels, Brian Herbert's expanded Dune-iverse, and the Dune Encyclopedia. In most cases, we'll be prioritizing the canonicity of the first two because Dune Prophecy does the same thing, and some of the stuff written in the encyclopedia is just too contradictory. But we'll be making note of a few interesting facts and tidbits from it that are relevant to the overall franchise, so keep an eye out for those. Now that we have that warning out of the way, let's begin by saying it's baffling that an organization like the Spacing Guild was never in place during humanity's original expansion to the stars, but that's just how it is. The Spacing Guild becomes such an important part of the Dune-iverse by the time of Paul Atreides that its formal incorporation starts the imperial calendar because, much like the birth of Christ, it changed the way humanity perceived space and time itself. Before the Guild, instead of using spice-fueled space jumping, they used conventional technology to reach the stars, which was a lot more diverse and a lot slower. Humanity had already spent thousands of years exploring the galaxy, but they did so through a mixture of varied spacefaring technology, none of which was standardized. Faster-than-light travel was possible, but it wasn't instantaneous, and exactly how it was made possible has never been properly explained. The old Empire's method of space travel is simply described as being able to outrun photons, but exactly how that's accomplished through their engines isn't specified. There were all sorts of starship classes, ranging from low to mid-capacity fighter jets called Kinjals to the carrier-class ballistae, which were one of the few ships with an interstellar travel capacity. Kinjals would be only deployed in battles and on planets, for instance, while ballistae would carry machinery and people from point A to point B utilizing FTL travel. Using a combination of these and other starship classes, mankind spread throughout the Milky Way galaxy and soon established itself as the ruling species of that system. And yes, before you ask us whether AI was involved, it most likely was. The computational challenges of traveling through space alone would necessitate guiding systems that were precise enough to avoid astronomical debris while ensuring a stable speed that made reaching the destination faster than one would believe. Seleucus Secundus, one of the foremost planets of the Old Empire and the location of the League of Nobles, was about 130 light-years away from Earth. Using the old conventional machine-driven FTL travel method, a starship could cover that distance in just over a month. We wish we were joking about that number, but Xavier Harkonnen himself says as much in Dune, the Butlerian Jihad. We know how ridiculous this sounds because the Dune Encyclopedia takes it upon itself to impress just how difficult faster-than-light space travel was for humanity to achieve. This is much faster than the amount of time it takes for light itself to reach Earth from Seleucus' star system. Seleucus Secundus is located in the Gamma Weiping system, which is the Chinese name for the Pisces constellation. Light from this system's star, Gamma Piscium, hits Earth after 135 years of travel. So, Somehow, the Brian Herbert starships were fast enough to outrun light, but not fast enough to make space travel instantaneous. We're pretty sure scientists were banging their heads on all kinds of walls when they heard that certain starship classes from the old empire were flying faster than light and were still not the pinnacle of space travel. But keeping this scientific dilemma aside, this system of using machine technology persisted for millennia, with artificial intelligence eventually accounting for well over half of humanity's navigational systems. Though we as a species had achieved the apex form of colonization, we were still divided amongst ourselves, and if you ask us, that was the real beginning of the need for a spacing guild in the Dune-iverse. The old empire was one of whimsical indulgence and gluttonous sin. It didn't matter what kind of extreme taboo subject they were looking to explore with their minds and bodies, so long as vice existed, they'd explore all forms of it and antagonize their fellow human beings while they were at it. This was an era where there was no great convention preventing warfare between nations and planets. Humanity was free to construct and destroy according to its heart's desire, and slavery was a staple of the era. You'd think that being an advanced planet-colonizing species that we'd rise above such things, but you'll find that progression and regression often go hand in hand. Humanity might have exploded beyond the confines of the sun, but it didn't forget its inherent human nature. War, discrimination, and excess became the norm as opposed to the exception, and the tribe of humans that got the worst of this were the practitioners of the Buddha-Islamic faiths. Religion wasn't uniform in this world. There were thousands of faiths, each having millions of followers in turn. The Buddha-Islamics were persecuted throughout the old empire for their pacifistic nature and faith in the higher mysteries, as opposed to the more modernized mind of the contemporary human. Several Buddha-Islamic groups spread to the fringes of the known universe to escape persecution, but those who couldn't were forced to live life in brutal slavery. We'll address this more in a few moments, but for now, what's important is that slavery became a common phenomenon during the rise of the machines, which is where the need for the Spacing Guild stems from as well. Some 2,000 years BEG, or before Guild, humanity was subjugated by a group of 20 cybernetically augmented people who called themselves Titans. These Titans were born from human stagnation because for thousands of years, mankind had made no real progress in any field of relevance. They were so busy indulging their desires and stoking their own differences that they ended up going inert in terms of civilizational progress, and this lack of ambition opened them up to a coup. The Titans, led by Agamemnon, Juno, and Tlaloc, used their scientific genius Barbarossa's new gel circuitry-based program to infect the old empire's AI systems. They were backed by the funding of the Prince of Rodale IX, who took for himself the name Xerxes. In a very short period of time, all of the robotic servants of the Empire fell under Titan control, and thus did the Age of Titans begin. It was a harsh, survival of the fittest kind of age that lasted for a century. Humanity was enslaved by the Titans based on their perceived superiority, and those that escaped the Titans' grasp were hunted down with extreme prejudice. However, not all humans fell victim to this AI attack. A group of about 10,000 worlds that was a few dozen light years away from Earth formed a resistance group called the League of Nobles. This league had not digitized itself entirely, so they were able to avoid the Titans' AI attack and set up a nexus of human resistance. When the Cymex came calling, the followers of the Buddha-Islamic traditions spread to the outer reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, occupying planets like Tulaxa and Arrakis. The Zen Sufis of Tulaxa would evolve into the Bene Tleilax from the main series, and the Zen Sunni wanderers that ended up on Arrakis would evolve into the Fremen. These groups felt that the arrival of the Cymek army was a sign of the end times, so they refused to participate in humanity's war of attrition against them and were persecuted heavily for it. The Buddha-Islamics couldn't escape slavery, whether they were living on human or machine worlds, because both sides saw them as lesser beings. The Titans, through their unnatural evolution, came to view all of humanity as being an inferior species, and humans, disgusted by the Buddha-Islamics' pacifist stance at a time of existential crisis, sought to use them as they saw fit to collect the debt they owed to humanity. One of these groups of Zen Sunni wanderers was enslaved on the planet Poratrin, which is why Fremen tradition records it as being their homeworld. We'll get to why that's a misconception in another section, but the reason we bring up Poratrin is because it was the planet where humanity finally managed to make a technological breakthrough that would render artificial intelligence obsolete, in a manner of speaking. The main reason that the discovery of a new system of interstellar travel became crucial was the rise of the thinking machines. Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. The Titans exploited much of humanity's total reliance on artificial intelligence to stage a bloodless but highly effective takeover. They then ruled over their inferiors for 10 decades, but the human desire for freedom surpasses any sort of logic or machine predictability. Within 80 years of Titan rule, humanity began rebelling against them, and it was one of these rebellions that led to the birth of Omnius. The Titan Xerxes, who was the sponsor of the Age of Titans and the ruler of what would become Ix, ceded too much control to his planet's AI system in an effort to protect it from rebellion. Xerxes' unbridled hedonism allowed the AI to gain sentience, and once it did, it immediately enslaved its own masters. The AI system gave itself the name Omnius and proceeded to bring every world under Titan and human control over to its sphere of influence. Omnius couldn't kill the Titans no matter how much he wished to because of a failsafe hard-coded into his program, so he used them as his pawns instead. He created update ships to send spheres made of gel circuitry technology to every planet under machine rule. These spheres would then assemble themselves into a version of Omnius, and by synchronizing the data of all his incarnations, Omnius created an artificial intelligence hive mind called the Evermind. The more sophisticated the Evermind got, the more power it would possess over spaceflight until it became the sole authority over all of space travel. The League of Nobles Ballistae and other classes of starship were prepared for battle, but with technophobia rising within the ranks of humanity, it was going to be difficult to come up with a way to counter Omnius's superior technology. For close to a millennium, the League of Nobles and the thinking machines were locked in a war of attrition. Instead of conducting major military offensives, they relied on sabotage, and every few decades, Omnius would send in a fleet to try and trip over humanity's hand. The last time he organized a major campaign was in 303 BG, when he unsuccessfully attacked the League capital, Seleucia Secundus. The reason for Omnius's slow and deliberate approach was multidimensional, but to put it rather plainly, he didn't hate humanity nearly as much as the Titans did. To him, they were a resource, and as a productive enterprise, his job was to protect that resource as much as possible. He would even make bets against other thinking machines with regards to humanity's loyalty towards the synchronized empire, so to call his thoughts on free humans complex would be an understatement. It wasn't as though he wasn't inclined to finish them off, he just wasn't willing to do it without good reason. That reason presented itself to him in the form of a losing bet, and he resumed hostilities with humanity in 203 BG when he sent a massive armada to Seleucia Secundus. Humanity was able to defend itself from Omnius's armada thanks to the quick wit and firm actions of Xavier Harkonnen. But in doing so, they also understood that the only way to beat technology was with technology. This is where the most important recognized inventor in human history comes into play, the man called Holtzman. The pompous savant, the ambitious merchant, and their hidden genius. The Dune Encyclopedia and Brian Herbert's expanded Dune books have several differences, but there are a few basic outlines and characters that are common between the two. These characters, in turn, have become inseparable from the history of the Spacing Guild, no matter how different their names might be across the franchise's literature. In the Dune Encyclopedia, the Butlerian Jihad is a consequence of the death of a child, but the manner in which it unravels is more like a horror thriller film. In it, House Rachesi is the most dominant technological power in the known universe, and the planet Komos is one of their most important planets. On that planet, a woman by the name of Jihan Butler enters a hospital expecting the safe and successful delivery of her child, but ends up being faced with the tragedy of losing it instead. Jihan discovers that her loss was not a natural occurrence, it was part of a wider conspiracy concocted by the machine administrators of the hospital and indeed the planet, because the thinking machines had long since taken control of their masters. Jihan sparked the Butlerian Jihad on Komos, which would later become Ix, and it was from this planet that the creator of the most important piece of tech also emerged, Norma Senva. The Dune Encyclopedia renames her Norma Senva, but she is acknowledged as being one of the first humans with prescient abilities in Frank Herbert's novels and in the extended Dune-iverse. She's basically a god. We'll talk about that more as we progress further down the rabbit hole, but according to the Dune Encyclopedia, once the Butlerian Jihad was over, Senva and her husband, Aurelius Venport, ramped up their research into non-computational methods of space travel. Because their efforts involved the use of technology, they were banished from Ix, and after wandering the stars for a few years, the Aurelian exiles reached the planet Tupile. Tupile had been ravaged by the Butlerians during the early stages of the Jihad, but over time, its location was lost to the known universe. When the exiles reached the planet around 100 BG, they were able to take advantage of the populace's hatred towards the Butlerians and establish centers for research that eventually resulted in the creation of fold space technology. Norma Senva was the one who figured out the secret to navigating through hyperspace safely when she used the spice melange, thanks to the influence of her Bene Gesserit friend Leona, and unraveled the secrets of prescience. She captained the first Highliner called the Golden Advent, and Norma's big mistake was thinking that the human mind could replace the computational and navigational abilities of a thinking machine. She hooked her own brain up to the Advent's command systems, and the sheer effort of steering it through hyperspace rendered her catatonic. Norma ended up dying when her husband Aurelius disappeared while seeking to perfect and repair her technology, but her work lived on through the Tupilians. The Tupilian member Frelo Mason of Aurelius and Norma's Research Society assumed control of the Highliner project and made it exclusive to Tupile's culture and identity. His son, Jasta, expanded the fleet and in the year 12 BG established contact with the Carino Empire to find a place for his people within the Imperium. The Spacing Guild's offer to provide safe passage to all subjects of the Carinos in exchange for secrecy with regards to their homeworld and a complete monopoly over space travel became the third leg of the tripod that stabilized the Imperium for 10 millennia. The Guild agreed to reinforce the terms of the Great Convention and turn Tupile into an exile planet. After the signing of the convention, any house that was defeated in a war of assassins or violated Conley would be packed off to Tupile. The secrecy of its location would ensure that they were never hunted down by their enemies, and it would protect Guild secrets at the same time. This version of the Spacing Guild's history is rather intriguing and holds some of the most scientific explanations for how space travel works in the Dune-iverse. But sadly, it's not canon to the Dune Prophecy timeline because we know that show follows the Brian Herbert books and the events described in them are wildly different to what the Dune Encyclopedia tells us. Perhaps the only thing that's carried over unchanged to the extended Dune-iverse is the fact that Tupile is the Spacing Guild's hidden exile planet because in Dune Messiah, Paul tries pressuring the Guild into revealing its location. Apart from that, most other things are different, including the characters of Aurelius and Norma, as well as the founder of the Holtzman effect. The Dune Encyclopedia tells us that the Holtzman effect was discovered by the son of the planetary governor of Liesco II, the mathematical genius known as Abraham von Holtzman. Through a series of unfortunate events, Holtzman was transformed into a thinking machine with the capacity to deeply think about physics, philosophy, and the secrets of the universe. Holtzman was launched into space by those who pursued his knowledge, but he beat them by putting himself in a stasis and placing his body in a particular orbit. Every couple of millennia or so, he would come close to his home planet, and when he did, he would regain consciousness. During the time he was active, he'd transmit his discoveries to humanity and help it evolve before returning to his slumber and repeating the process all over again. When Abraham began his journey, humans and thinking machines coexisted. By his fifth pass, the Butlerian Jihad was at an end, and humanity was bent upon eradicating all thinking machines, even ones that had helped them advance their technology by light years. Abraham's original work focused on the mysterious suspensor nullification effect which made spaceflight possible across the known universe, but through his own ponderings, he discovered the principle that made it work, the Holtzman effect. This technological deus ex machina can only be described as a new universal force whose discovery altered the course of life itself. To put it in as simple terms as possible, the Holtzman effect governs the attractive and repulsive forces between subatomic particles to such an extent that its application on a three-dimensional level can affect the space-time continuum. The effect theoretically exists everywhere at all points in time, but to access it, there are a few basic requirements. The Holtzman effect, in its most basic form, manifests as a Holtzman wave. The Holtzman wave is related to light and the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's not of that spectrum. For whereas light is radiation, it induces heat in substances which absorb it, the Holtzman wave, or H-wave, induces a kinetic force. Light encourages vibration in one manner, i.e. spatially, but the H-wave encourages another form of vibration, a quantum/temporal vibration. Because of this temporal relationship, a number of things are possible when the H-wave is properly used. It makes the transmission of radio signals from one end of the universe to the other near instantaneous by causing space-time to form micro-catastrophic folds along a selectable vector, leading to the excitation of local matter. This produces long-wave radio emissions receivable by normal antenna. According to a theory, the background radio emissions which blanket the visible universe are Holtzman waves transmissions of civilizations in the galactic core, which makes its theoretical range infinite. By using a Holtzman field generator, one could create a Holtzman shield and a Holtzman suspensor, both of which apply different aspects of Abraham's unified theory. The Holtzman shield is an energy blanket that covers the user's body in a Holtzman field whose permeability is determined by the velocity of an object entering it. This allows its user to breathe and move freely without getting crushed by the pressure difference, whilst discouraging fast attacks against them. Holtzman shields necessitated the creation of a new style of fighting for the entire universe, and that was just the beginning. Holtzman suspensors effectively negate gravity with relation to the mass of an object, allowing them to levitate in mid-air. These suspensors are responsible for the floating Baron memes that went viral around the time Dune Part 2 came out, as well as the glow globes that you see following characters in the new Dune adaptations. But perhaps the greatest use of the Holtzman effect comes from its ability to fold space itself. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why all of what we've just told you guys is relevant to the foundations of the Spacing Guild. The Dune Encyclopedia takes a more realistic approach to its scientific advancement. Frank Herbert never really went into the mechanics of his technology or science, instead choosing to focus on world-building details. This was done with the encyclopedia and through the extended Dune-iverse. Like we mentioned at the end of the previous segment, the name Holtzman changed the way the known universe perceived space and time itself, but unlike the encyclopedia's version of events, the extended Dune-iverse discovered its titular effects far later in the timeline and under far different circumstances. Like we mentioned at the beginning of this segment, though most details in all sequel material to Frank Herbert's original work clash with one another, there are a few that managed to survive crossing the bridge of canonicity. Though the 7,000-year-old Abraham von Holtzman didn't make it, his surname did. His first name was repackaged to Tio, which is a weirdly appropriate nod to Hector Salamanca, because this guy was as ruthless as that mob boss from the Breaking Bad universe. Tio Holtzman was the man to discover the Holtzman effect in the extended Dune-iverse. Unlike the Dune Encyclopedia, in Brian Herbert's work, the theory came before the practical application. From his discovery of the Holtzman effect, Tio devised scrambler technology, which was a key line of defense against the thinking machine threat. Omnius and his entire empire was built upon gel circuitry, which was very difficult to disable through conventional means. If you tried to shoot it or blow it up, it would repair itself at an alarming speed, and shutting one down was only possible if it were captured first. Holtzman's scrambler technology would instantly fry the gel circuitry of any Omnius-controlled robot or spaceship, making it the first proper line of defense against the machine empire. Using the scrambler web as a baseline, other weapons like scrambler grenades were developed to shut down thinking machines on the field of battle, but there was a major oversight in Holtzman's design. Scrambler technology could only work against gel circuitry. If a League world was attacked by Cymex, who had mechanical bodies but organic brains, his scramblers would be ineffective against them, and this led to the need for further innovation in Holtzman's work. As a modern-day savant, Tio was more concerned with keeping up his image rather than innovating on his discoveries because he was, quite frankly, out of ideas. Though his technology promised protection against the machines, it failed to work as advertised during the Omnius attack on Seleucus Secundus that we mentioned in the first segment. If Xavier Harkonnen had not taken control of that situation, the League would have lost its capital and Tio would have lost his head. Because he did, the savant was spared, but public opinion of him deteriorated drastically. He knew he had to come up with something new to regain their favor, which is when he met the person that would actually revolutionize human history, Norma Senva. In the Dune Encyclopedia, Norma is an Ixian scientist who uses Abraham von Holtzman's unified effect theory to develop spaceships capable of instantaneous hyperspace travel. She has help from a Bene Gesserit sister, her husband Aurelius, and the entire population of the hidden world of Tupile, which ends up becoming the Spacing Guild's secret homeworld. In the extended Dune-iverse, she is a daughter of a Rossack sorceress who goes on to shape the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood and the Spacing Guild as we know it. The word Rossack has only been used a couple of times by Frank Herbert. The most prominent use of it comes from his first novel, when Lady Jessica became a Reverend Mother. She saw the entire history of Fremen Sayadinya's race through her mind after taking the Water of Life, including the inception point at Rossack, where the first Sayadinya took the Rossack drug. The Fremen are descended from the Zen-Sunni wanderers who were said to stop at Rossack for a few generations during their eternal migration, so it makes sense that it would be a hotbed for sisterhood activity. What makes it so unique is the fact that its inhospitable environment is what created the Bene Gesserit, or at least was responsible for their creation. Rorschach is a mostly volcanic planet with a deadly atmosphere and several poisonous plants whose toxins had no known cures. The environment of Rorschach was so awful that it often caused genetic defects in the children born on the planet, leading to early death or extremely tough lives at the very least. Only a handful of children survived these conditions and retained the appearance of regular humans, and those that did were granted psychic powers. The conditions on Rorschach were crucial to the development of many Bene Gesserit skills, like the precise manipulation of one's own anatomy and the ability to unlock the prescient eye. Before the Sisterhood came into contact with the spice, they used an awareness spectrum narcotic called the Rorschach drug to undergo the agony. The first Fremen Sayadinya took the Rorschach drug to open her prescient eye long before the Zensuni migrated to Arrakis. Human occupation of the planet was relatively recent, and yet the sorceresses of Rorschach had risen up to become a formidable power close to the time of the Jihad. They were extremely chauvinistic women who looked down on the people of their planet because they couldn't survive like them. The deformed children of their subset of humans were called Mistborn, and were often taken into the wild jungles of the planet and left to die. Norma Senva was supposed to suffer a similar fate, but for some reason she didn't, and that one act of kindness changed the entire cosmos. She was born the daughter of the Sorceress Supreme of Rorschach, Zufa Senva. Zufa was a woman who believed her duty to the Order to be her entire life's work, and to that end she pretty much micromanaged their genetic breeding program, including her own reproduction. Zufa carefully selected every mate she'd ever had in her life to ensure that her own genes were passed down to the best possible quality of human. Even after she'd become a mother, Zufa chose the wealthy Rorschach businessman Aurelius Venport for her mate, a man who had grown rich dealing with the plants and poisons of his world. Yet, for some reason, the only child she'd managed to give birth to for a long time was the malformed dwarf woman we call Norma. Zufa abhorred her child in the beginning and shunned her at every given turn. She left Norma in the care of Aurelius, pretty much, and didn't even pay attention to the fact that she was clearly a mathematical prodigy. Even as a young child, Norma was coming up with equations that rivaled those of the savant Theo Holtzman, so Aurelius, who cared for the girl, decided to give her the environment she deserved. He went against Zufa's wishes and sent one of Norma's papers to Theo, who was so impressed by her work that he invited her to Portrin to become his research assistant. A Rorschach sorceress could use her psychic abilities to create a shockwave that killed any brain within a certain blast radius. They turned the power of the mind into a physical weapon with tangible consequences that ended up turning the wrath of the machines towards them. The Titan Barbarossa's killing at the hands of sorceress Himoa made Rorschach one of Omnius's primary targets, and he attacked the planet every single time he made a move against humanity. But Norma used her mind to create something that went beyond warfare. She created an entirely new wing of technology. During her time with Aurelius Venport, Norma took his discovery of the Holtzman effect to new heights by developing the shield, the suspensors, and the glow globes. She didn't care that Holtzman took the credit and the money from her inventions, because to her, these things were her contribution to the jihad effort. You could tell Theo had no idea how some of the things he'd slapped his name onto worked in the first place, because he nearly caused a nuclear explosion due to his ignorance with regards to how a shield works. Like we mentioned earlier, Holtzman shields are basically force fields that only allow objects below a certain velocity to enter their spectrum, but ultimately, they're nothing more than a blanket of energy. If this energy is struck with a laser gun, the resulting chain reaction between the molecules from the shield and the molecules from the laser would cause instant nuclear fission, resulting in an atomic blast. Norma had to blow up an asteroid to prove it to him, but instead of making him more introspective, it made Holtzman vindictive. He pushed Norma out of his facilities and tried to steal her life's work, but in the end, his hubris and cruelty caught up with him. Holtzman had a habit of using slaves in his experiments, something Norma vehemently opposed during her time with him. So it's only fitting that one of those slaves ended up blowing Teo's shield into a mushroom cloud with a laser gun. The reason Teo drove Norma away from Portrin and into the hands of the Titan Xerxes was simple. He realized the potential of her fold space equations. If she succeeded, Norma would revolutionize space travel forever and become far richer than any person before or after her. Xerxes didn't really care about all this or even know about it when he proceeded to torture her in space. Now, normally, torturing a resident of Rorschach is a dumb idea because, in a way, their entire lives are torturous. But Norma had something most people on her planet wouldn't, and that was the psionic power-granting artifact called the Seuss Stone. This stone, when attuned with the pain and heightened emotions elicited by the torture, unlocked Norma's latent sorceress genes and allowed her to kill her tormentors with her newfound abilities. Norma unlocked her other memory and gained complete control over her physiology, becoming one of the first Reverend Mothers of the Bene Gesserit. She used the forms of the women from her prescience to transform her own body, and this is one place where we must acknowledge the Dune Encyclopedia for a moment. Over there, the Bene Gesserit evolved from a group of mystical women from Earth, and the Bene Gesserit name evolved over millennia to become what it is today. It felt more like natural progression when compared to the DNA-altering planetary backstory of the sorceresses of Rorschach, but now that we've got that out of the way, let us get back to the story of Norma. By unlocking her prescient abilities, Norma came to possess a deep understanding of how the Holtzman effect affected the fabric of spacetime and could finally create a device to harness its true potential. In the Dune Encyclopedia, we were given a small hint about the Holtzman effect's ability to breach the spacetime continuum and manipulate it with an entry point source node and exit the void upon reaching their destination. This concept is expanded upon by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, who call it fold space, a pocket dimension that any object can enter if they're vibrating at a certain frequency of the Holtzman effect. Norma foresaw with her prescient eye that the planet Kolhar would become the first world to house her new technology, so she traveled there and summoned her mother and stepdad/future husband to help her. That's right, folks. Dune did dwarf discrimination, weird family incest angles way before HBO did, but at least in this case, there was no direct blood relation involved. At Kolhar, Norma started her great work of turning the planet's icy surface into a field of docking and repair bays for her newly conceived highliners, which would house the space-folding Holtzman engines. These engines, harnessing the power of the Holtzman effect, would make a highliner enter the fold space dimension at point A and emerge at point B, with navigation being handled by an external entity. Norma had already created a prototype of this class of starship back on Poratrin between 177 and 174 BG, but she couldn't exactly use it like she couldn't properly use the rest of her Highliner fleet for one simple reason. She couldn't chart a safe course through space just yet. The basic scientific concepts of the Holtzman effect seem to be consistent across the Dune Encyclopedia and the extended Dune-iverse. The main difference is the amount of time it takes for Norma to figure out that spice is the answer. In the former, she has the help of a Bene Gesserit sister who allows her to experience a spice trance before completing her work. But in the latter, spice was discovered only some 3 decades beyond spacefolding becoming viable. One of Norma's husband's associates, the Tlulaxa Tuk Kider, had visited the fringe world Arrakis and discovered the geriatric spice melange through his dealings with the native Fremen. In Children of Dune, we're told that the imperial chemist Jan Shop Ashkoko first noticed the geriatric properties of spice during the reign of Shakad the Wise. But considering the hot mess that Dune's timeline is, that statement can be considered retconned, or just a recollection of a rediscovery of spice. Frank Herbert's original series did make it seem like melange was a relatively recent discovery for humans, despite the Spacing Guild using it for 10 millennia. There's even a moment in the first novel where Paul realizes that all he has to do to bring the guild under control is monopolize spice, because his prescient visions had told him that spice was their key to power. But once again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Initially, spice was sold to Took as a life-extending drug, which quickly found popularity within the high-rent district of the League of Nobles. Took created Venki Enterprises alongside Aurelius to profit off of spice sales, and for a while business was booming. But eventually his sins caught up with him as well, and Took was forced to escape Poratrin around the same time that Senva was banished. His escape was far less forgiving because he took Norma's prototype highliner and crash-landed it on Arrakis of all places, along with a bunch of people that he'd once enslaved and sold. Tuk Kider spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of the free men of Arrakis, but his efforts in discovering the spice for the known universe did not go in vain. Over time, Norma came to realize the prescient powers hidden within the spice. For the first few years out of the first century that spacefolding was available to humans, she used thinking machines to perform navigational computations, but she wasn't happy with the results. 1 out of every 10 highliners would go missing, and once the Butlerian jihadis found out that the very thing they were trying to destroy was now carrying them to their targets, they threatened to annihilate the fleet, even if it meant losing to Omnius. Norma was forced to navigate without machines, which led to disastrous consequences, like entire crews being immolated by a star they accidentally dropped inside of. Her husband, Aurelius, had promised her highliners to the jihadis following negotiations with Serena Butler herself, but Norma was horrified by the fact that 1/5 of the fleet that went out during the Great Purge returned home safely. She invested more time and resources into coming up with an alternative computational apparatus for obvious reasons, and it wasn't easy, we'll tell you that much. She struggled with finding the answer with every passing year, and her intake of melange became more insistent every passing year, until one day, gripped in a spice trance, she came to a realization. Norma was allergic to spice, but regardless of that, she decided to have a chamber built that she could then flood with spice gas. She placed herself within that chamber and realized her full potential as the universe's first guild navigator. Norma's combined telekinetic and prescient abilities allowed her to function as a Holtzman engine herself, though that fact was only revealed to a select few individuals throughout history. Once Norma cracked the code on safe space travel, fold space technology became the most valuable technology in the universe, and it was initially monopolized by Venki Enterprises. This, along with their exclusive spice mining rights, made them the most powerful commercial organization in the universe. For a few decades, life as it was known was controlled by Aurelius Venport and Norma Senva's descendants, but instantaneous space travel wasn't made readily available to the entire Imperium. In response to this, House Carino broke its contract with Venki and allowed other companies to mine spice as well as create Holtzman engines of their own. Through the actions of a pompous savant, an ambitious merchant, and a hidden genius, the very concept of transportation had been rebuilt on a molecular level. So, naturally, preserving it became the order of the day, and through that preservation emerged the Spacing Guild. The Galactic Civil War and the establishment of the Spacing Guild. Despite being relatively pacifistic during the entire conflict, Venki Enterprises became the foremost organization tied to the Butlerian Jihad thanks to their fold space technology. Once Norma became a guild navigator, her son Adrian formally incorporated the Fold Space Shipping Company, through which he aimed to monopolize all transportation in space. His ambition carried over to his grandson Joseph, who took Venki to its highest of highs and then plunged it to its lowest of lows. Upon taking charge of Venki Enterprises, Joseph renamed it Venport Holdings and proceeded to engage in a game of political sabotage and deception. He couldn't do anything to stop the Emperor from handing out Holtzman engines to other companies, so he messed with their navigation instead, and deliberately hid the secret of Norma's existence from the universe. He also sabotaged many of his enemies' spice harvesters, all in the name of maximizing his family's profits. Venport Holdings' profits and services became so diverse that Joseph had to create a new company called Combined Mercantiles just to handle all his business. And it was this company that later became the Intergalactic Economic Organization, CHOAM. Despite living in a post-jihad world, Joseph Venport was a practical man, and he would use technology however he deemed fit instead of relinquishing it to the tide of a fanatical movement. He was once in prime position to acquire a shipyard full of inert thinking machines, but his efforts were thwarted by the Butlerians, for which he declared all-out war on them. Joseph Venport and Manfred Torondo, leader of the Butlerians, engaged in a conflict that ultimately required imperial intervention to resolve. The Butlerians, spurred on by religious fervor, bombed Venport's main base on Kolhar with atomics, forcing them to move Norma's junction elsewhere. Joseph, in return, hired assassins to kill their leader, as well as the reigning emperor Salvador Carino, who had decided to side with the extremists. Though the latter plan succeeded, the former failed, and Joseph was persecuted by both the Butlerians and the imperial house as a result of his actions. In the end, it was his great-grandmother who saved his life, and in doing so, changed the course of human history. If you guys didn't notice, we said that Joseph Venport deliberately hid Norma's existence from the universe. When we say that, we don't mean her physical existence because she makes many public appearances even after undergoing her transformation. We mean her status as a guild navigator, because though Joseph had lost his monopoly on Holtzman engines and space mining, he'd managed to preserve the most important secret that linked the two of them. By keeping his navigators a secret, Joseph made sure that no one but Venport navigators could ensure the safety of those they were transporting, and Norma used this to her advantage to bring about a new age of humanity. After Joseph's assassination of Emperor Salvador, Salvador's brother Roderick took the Golden Lion throne. Roderick was a known detractor of the Butlerian movement, so Joseph had hoped to find an ally in him, but when Roderick got involved, he He was betrayed by his own family member, albeit with good reason. The war between the Butlerians and Venport was tearing apart the newfound peace and unity at the seams. It was the Emperor's job to put down the rebels and reinforce his authority, but he couldn't do that when one side could literally vanish into thin space. So, Roderick formed a clandestine alliance with Norma Senva to bring the hostilities to an end and bind up the wounds of the Jihad once and for all. By this time, Norma had undergone an intense second transformation that ended up making her appear as inhuman as physically possible. She had webbed hands and feet, her head was larger than her body, and she would swim in the spice gas that flooded her clear chamber. But she no longer had those human desires that made her turn herself into a beautiful woman in the first place. Instead, all Norma wanted was to create a new world order which preserved her existence, her work, and the legacy of her loved ones. So, when Joseph and Manfred were having their last stand battle, Norma transported Imperial starships to their location, and Roderick dealt with the perpetrators of civil war. He agreed to break up Venport Holdings' strangle on universal trade and commerce by keeping only one of its subsidiaries alive, Fold Space Shipping Company. Roderick agreed to giving FSC exclusive rights to space travel and navigator creation in exchange for turning spice into an Imperial resource. Norma agreed because she already had a contingency plan for its procurement set in place. When Carino battleships showed up in the skies above Denali, Joseph Venport figured his ancestor had betrayed him, but even that was by design. Before he could die, Norma teleported to his location and took him into her spice chamber. Yes, she'd agreed to let the Emperor handle the Butlerians and the Ven holders however he deemed fit, but she'd also convinced him to spare the lives of all of her navigators and keep the Guild's home planet, as well as the economic center of Tupile, a secret. Once Joseph became a navigator, he would become a part of this agreement and thus would be saved. The Galactic Civil War ended with the consolidation of Carino power throughout the Imperium and the formal integration of the Spacing Guild within its ranks. The decades that followed the Jihad are described differently in the Dune Encyclopedia and the extended Dune-iverse. In the former, humanity entered a dark age after the fall of the thinking machines because they no longer had the means to travel or trade on an interstellar level. It was only when the Spacing Guild sent a representative to the Carinos from their home base at Tupile that things became somewhat normal, and the Imperium surpassed its former glory. In the latter, trade and travel were not affected so severely that a dark age ensued because conventional spaceflight was still available to us and was used by several groups. Instead of being a closely guarded secret, Fold Space technology had helped humanity win the Jihad against Omnius and was now going to become a unifying force throughout the Imperium. In the years that followed the Jihad, House Carino maintained a rather delicate balance of power in its new empire, using only military strength as an arbiter. The League of Nobles was replaced by the Landsraad Council as the apex governing body of the Imperium, but nothing would be possible without proper trade and travel apparatus. Those would emerge with the breaking up of Venport Holdings in the form of CHOAM and the Spacing Guild. Every house of note was given shares in CHOAM, which became the sole regulator of interstellar trade. CHOAM worked closely with the Spacing Guild to transport trade goods all across the Imperium in exchange for a silent cut of the action. This political tripod is what ended up making the Imperium one of the most stable empires in human history, and the Guild was its bonding factor. Without the Spacing Guild's guarantee of safe interstellar travel with access to all peoples, the universe would have exploded into another conflict, worse than the Galactic Civil War. By hiding strategic resources like Tupile and strategic information like the process of birthing a navigator, the Guild made itself indispensable and practically invulnerable to royal interference. Kolar might have been decimated by the Butlerians, but by this time, Norma had the resources to create a junction planet pretty much anywhere. She re-established her base of operations and created the only navigator school in the known universe. Junction became the heart of all Guild operations for the next 15 millennia. It was where navigators went to learn their craft and also where they were laid to rest. Before, humanity would be at the mercy of thinking machines and would spend days, months, and sometimes years traveling to their galactic destinations. The advent of instantaneous space travel was so revolutionary that the imperial calendar is dated from the day it was incorporated, and that's justified. If you manage to come up with a way to transport goods and folks across the universe in a couple of days at best, we'll rename our calendar based on your discoveries, because that's how fundamentally life-altering such a discovery becomes. We dream of the days when humanity will spread to the stars, and it's very likely that when that day arrives, every world religion will be forced to revise its tenets to account for it. For residents of the Dune-iverse, that day arrived on the first day of the first year after Guild incorporation because it started a new era for civilization itself. Gone were the days when people would be forced to travel between two planets under the auspices of an organization that they weren't sure would even be recognized at their destination. With the centralization of trade, travel, and governance, human society reached the pinnacle of a uniform yet free existence under the Carino Empire. Yes, things flowed through only a certain set of organizations, but humans were free to trade in whatever they considered to be a resource, and the Spacing Guild ensured that a war like the old days would never break out. 10,000 years of interstellar monopolization broken by two men. From the moment she was conceived on Rossack to the moment she appeared on Denali, Norma Senva had managed to change the complexion of humanity. Her efforts brought about a tangible peace and outlawed warfare in human society, and for 10,000 years, the Spacing Guild was the enforcer of the Great Convention. The Convention was the single greatest legally binding document that humanity ever produced, even greater than the Orange Catholic Bible, because the latter's word could be ignored, but doing so to the former would result in death or worse. This is because if any house violated the tenets of the Convention, they'd lose their shipping privileges to begin with, and effectively be banished from the Landsraad. The entire point of the Convention is to prevent all conventional forms of warfare among humans, including atomic warfare, which earned any house that engaged in it a one-way ticket to Two-Pile. Even the ever-greedy and sneaky Harkonnens wouldn't dare to violate the Guild peace. In the first Dune novel, Duke Leto Atreides shuts down his son's curiosity with regards to these alien-like humans while pointing out that an Atreides ship could be transported alongside a Harkonnen ship and neither of them would violate the laws of the Convention at the risk of losing shipping privileges. Leto goes so far as to discourage Paul from seeking out a guildsman because he doesn't want to do anything that will revoke his shipping rights. This itself tells you all you need to know about the Guild's power centuries after its creation. The Spacing Guild's origins and inner workings are shrouded in complete secrecy in the main Dune books. Most people know that their navigators do not appear human, but they don't know why. Even the rank and file of the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood are unaware of their spice dependency, as evidenced by Jessica being shocked by Paul's realization of the same. Our leading theory on why this information was lost to most humans, except the Imperial House and the higher-ups of the Guild, is simply the passage of time. It's one of House Carino's most crucial assets in maintaining universal peace, so hiding their usage of the spice melange becomes an issue of state security, not commerce. Spice was exposed to the known universe well before a space folding was perfected. When Omnius unleashed the Omnius Scourge upon humanity, Tisia Senva, Norma's younger sister, offered up spice as a medicine to treat it. Most of mankind was only aware of spice's health benefits and lifespan protraction abilities, which was enough to make it the most in-demand commodity in the universe. But its prescient powers were kept top secret by the Guild and the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, both of whom used it for their own purposes. This is why we particularly dislike the video book scenes from Villeneuve's first Dune movie, because it basically tells us that the Guild is dependent on spice. By making Arrakis an imperial domain, House Carino ensured that spice flowed the way they wanted it to, but even then, the Spacing Guild had its own arrangements for acquiring melange. Guild agents had cut deals with the Fremen to give them protection from weather satellites and imperial raiders that weren't assigned to govern Arrakis. In exchange, the Fremen would give them as much spice as they required, and the Guild required a lot of spice. Speaking of the Guild, let us briefly touch upon the two broad wings of employees that they hired. The first, obviously, were the navigators, who made the entire operation possible. There were several stages of navigators, with early-stage navigators being able to blend with human society by using disguises. The further one went in their navigator training, the more inhuman their appearance became, until they reached Stage 3 and became a full-fledged steersman. A steersman is the highest title a Guild navigator can achieve, and it's also the title most people that join the Guild aspire towards. But the Spacing Guild also provided banking services and had an entire economic and administrative wing that engaged with issues like commerce, diplomacy, and communications on a daily basis. The navigators were restricted to their glass boxes because of the inherent requirements of space folding. Guild navigators can only perform successful space folding by immersing themselves in spice gas and forcing an evolution beyond the confines of humanity. And because spice is highly addictive, exiting this environment could lead to instant death. If even a slight percentage of the gas was diluted, a navigator's prescient powers would become dull, and all trade and transportation within the Imperium would grind to a halt. This is why the Spacing Guild's spice smuggling is mostly given a blind eye, because without the spice, people couldn't get from point A to point B for centuries. And to oversee all of this, including things like contract negotiations and such, the Guild created a wing of administrators to interact with the Imperium. Speaking of centuries, thanks to all these factors, the millennia that followed the creation of the Guild was also called the Age of the Guild's Peace. For 10,000 years, the Spacing Guild kept the Imperium mostly free of conflict and provided sanctuary to those houses that lost wars of assassins or were banished for violating Conley. Whenever they did involve themselves in a dispute, they did so to protect their own interests, especially with regards to the spice. Over time, space travel became so expensive that it would take 1.4 million Solaris for a round trip from Kaitan to Caladan for what was essentially a formality. But the Guild's power never waned, so long as spice remained available to them. Perhaps that's the reason that the unusually neutral Spacing Guild took a rare side when the Tleilaxu conquered the planet Ix, and again when Paul Atreides came to power. Shortly before the Arrakis controversy, Emperor Shaddam Corrino hatched a plot to rid himself of his dependency on the Spacing Guild. Through a discreet alliance with the Tleilaxu, he funded Project Amal, whose goal was to create a synthetic spice that could replace actual Malan. If Shaddam had control of the only geriatric substance in the world, the Guild would be forced to do his bidding, and that would finally make House Corrino the undisputed rulers of the Imperium. For a while, the plan proceeded as it was laid out. The Tleilaxu conquered Ix, renamed it Zutta, and started developing prototypes of their synthetic spice. The Ixian brotherly duo of Kater and Demur Pilru worked together to get the Tleilaxu off their homeworld, but they didn't realize their true goal. Demur, who was a navigator, ended up becoming the first test subject of Shaddam's synthetic spice, and the results were disastrous. He ended up spacefolding to an undiscovered edge of the universe, and the synthetic spice triggered a reaction in his body that ended up killing him. The failure of Project Amal, coupled with the Guild's involvement in retaking Ix for House Vernius, put an end to all of Shaddam's ambitions for independence and made him complicit in all their future conspiracies. The Guild was one of the main facilitators of Emperor Shaddam Corrino's conspiracy against House Atreides, and because they were wary of the future that Paul presented to them. As users of the spice melange, they had what we call a mathematical form of prescience. Through centuries of habit and evolution, Guild navigators had come to rely on their prescience for charting a course through fold space, not to predict future events that concerned all of humanity. The Guild could tell Paul was an extremely powerful prescient being, but they couldn't tell whether he was friend or foe, for those with the power of prescience are hidden from another oracle's searching eyes. The Spacing Guild's powers were turned towards guidance, not deciphering the meaning of future events, so when they saw Paul as a threat to their authority, they did all that they could to eliminate him. The first Villeneuve movie tells us that the Baron spent nearly 60 years worth of income generated from the spice trade to transport all of his ships to Arrakis for the Desert War. His mobilization was a blatant violation of Canley because the Baron involved the Emperor himself. Shaddam was supposed to be a neutral mediator in the war between the Atreides and the Harkonnen, according to the tenets of the Great Convention, but because he lent his Sardaukar forces to the Baron, he became complicit in the Arrakis affair, and was thus open to scrutiny by the Guild, the Landsraad, and all other stakeholders in galactic governance. The Spacing Guild probably didn't care about any of these petty political struggles, so long as their most vital resource was preserved. It was when this spice was threatened that they showed their true colors. In the Dune movie, the Great Houses arrive on Arrakis as a result of the Baron's manipulations. He tells them that Shaddam violated Conley, and they show up to destroy him, not Paul. But they don't accept Paul's ascendancy either, which prompts him to threaten the obliteration of all spice fields using the Atreides atomics. This is very different from what happens in the books, because there, Paul first takes control of Arrakis and then fights the Emperor's representatives. The Spacing Guild lowers its cost of travel one time only, transporting every Great House's battleship to Arrakis' orbit along with the Imperial Guard, but they quickly back down when Paul reveals his plans for the spice. If the Guild doesn't obey him, he will poison every spice field on Arrakis and destroy the all-important resource of the universe. He knew that the Guild would agree to his demands because of their spice dependency, and once that happened, spaceflight would be under his control. Paul monopolized the spice, and this allowed him to control much of the flow of traffic and commerce through the Imperium during his time as Emperor. So, The Spacing Guild retaliated by doing the two things that it could do, aiding rebellion and abetting assassination. A few years after Paul's ascension, House Thorvald rose up in rebellion and created a resistance force that had the unspoken backing of the Spacing Guild. They were gathering a fleet to obliterate Paul's home planet when Muad'Dib learned of their plot through prescience. He immediately made his way to the navigator Beric, who had been an architect of this scheme. Through a combination of his control of spice and his immense power as the Kwisatz Haderach, Paul deciphered the scheme down to its minute details and forced Beric to strand his co-conspirators in deep space with no long-term rations to sustain their lives. He then sterilized the Thorvald homeworld to remind the universe that if you were not an ally of Muad'Dib, you were his enemy. Though the Spacing Guild was rewarded with a generous cachet of melange, the monopoly remained in place, which ultimately forced them to make another attempt on Paul's life, only this time in the most roundabout fashion possible. In Dune Messiah, we learn that Mother Superior Gaius Helen Mohiam had brought together a group of people to kill Paul and end his tyranny. This group includes Paul's wife Irulan, the Tleilaxu face dancer Scytale, Paul's high priest Korba, and the Spacing Guild navigator Edric, whose presence is crucial to the plot. As prescient beings have a difficult time spotting one another within the timescape, Edric became the conspirators' shield against Paul's prescience. He was the one transporting most of his allies to and from Arrakis, and once it was finished, he presented Paul with the Tleilaxu Gola of Duncan, Idaho called Hate. The plan was to use Hate to force Paul to reflect on the empire he had built, which they hoped would lead to him abdicating the throne. If that failed, Hate had been implanted with a set of instructions which included killing Paul when certain conditions were met. If that failed as well, the Tleilaxu hoped to use love to weaken the Emperor, because if Hate recovered his Duncan memories, they could bring back anyone from Paul's past and make it as though they'd never left him, provided they recovered fresh genetic material of hers. Plans within plans within plans. This is a staple feature of the Dune franchise and one that the Guild needed to involve itself with if it wanted to survive. Spice rationing was proving disastrous to their profits and control over the Imperium, so the sooner they got rid of Paul, the better it was going to be for them. Unfortunately, all they did by conspiring against him was get themselves marginalized because it resulted in the fruition of the very fate they were trying to avoid. When Paul discovered the conspiracy, he chose not to give in to it and killed the two messengers who brought him its message. Because he'd been blinded, Paul went into the desert, but told his sister and regent Aaliyah that no harm should come to the rest of the conspirators. Aaliyah, of course, didn't listen to her brother and had Gaius, Korba, Edric, and every other conspirator that tried to kill her brother executed. The Spacing Guild's bid to regain autonomy truly died when Paul's son ascended to the throne as his heir, because where the father refused to walk a dreaded path, the son dedicated himself to it, heart and soul. For all his powers and abilities, Muad'Dib was not all-powerful because he rejected embracing his terrible purpose. Paul's prescience had shown him a path forward for humanity which necessitated terrible oppression as a means for evolution. He could not brutalize his people any more than he already had, so he chose trusting in the Guild's peace as opposed to building his own. But his son Leto saw that this wasn't an optional path to evolution and survival, it was the only way. Even before Paul became emperor, the Fremen had started the process of terraforming Arrakis in anticipation of their green paradise. The tumult of Paul's reign put a pause on these efforts, but when Leto took the throne, he resumed them with utmost ferocity. Within a few years, Arrakis was no longer a desert, but a lush green paradise, utterly devoid of sandworms and sand trout, with the exception of the single God Emperor. Through prescience, Leto had come to understand that in order to keep humanity on his golden path, he needed to oppress it on a molecular level. To do that, he needed to eliminate spice from the economy, so he terraformed Arrakis and became the sole producer of spice as a human sandworm hybrid. Leto hoarded spice and gave it out to groups like the Sisterhood and the Spacing Guild in such negligible amounts that they might as well have not received it. Space travel was brought to a complete halt, and every human was forced to live in uniform villages and towns on their own planets for 35 centuries. After dominating imperial politics for 10 millennia, the Spacing Guild lost all of its power to the Atreides and ended up becoming subservient to them throughout the reigns of Paul and the God Emperor. This was especially true in the latter's case, who overturned galactic governance with the establishment of his fish-speaker army. Leto's fish-speaking women warriors were fighters as well as bureaucrats, and not a single person in the Imperium was allowed to move a muscle without their authority. In time, this caused humanity's freedom instinct to atrophy and fester within their unconscious minds, as their conscious lives were spent in peace and tranquility. Leto's golden path was focused on achieving two major objectives. The first was the creation of an undying spirit for exploration and escape from persecution, which he hoped would cause such an eruption of humanity across the cosmos that no one power would ever be able to rule over them again. The second was the eradication of human dependency on prescience, which he ironically enough wanted to obtain through spice. Leto minimized the Guild and the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood during his reign as God Emperor because both of those organizations worshipped at the altar of spice. The Guild used it in their navigational computations, and the Sisters used it to look into the past as well as the future. So long as such beings existed, humanity would never be free from the clutches of prescience, whose horrors Leto was all too intimately familiar with. So, he took control of the Bene Gesserit breeding program and allowed the Ixian Confederacy to violate the tenets of the Butlerian Jihad in secret. It took many centuries for Leto's prescient hope to finally come to fruition, but towards the end of his 3,000 plus years of existence, it finally happened. And when it did, it turned the Spacing Guild's entire existence into a full circle moment. The eventual, yet inevitable demise of the Spacing Guild. The death of the God Emperor occurred in the year 13,725 AG. Leto had been ruling for millennia at this point, and consequently, he had a lot of time to chart out his golden path. In doing so, he realized that humanity's reunion with machine technology was inevitable because machines would end up being their salvation from prescience. Leto was maintaining his breeding program as a means to foster genes that prescience was blind to, but he knew that technology would beat him to it, and it did, within his own lifetime. The God Emperor had a silent agreement with the Ixians through which he permitted them to create thinking machines once again. Leto himself used one of these machines to record his thoughts and author the stolen journals. He also used Ixian weather devices to maintain a small patch of desert on terraformed Arrakis just for himself, which goes to show you just how much foresight he had into the future. Leto knew that technology would only become a crutch if humans let it become one, and he had hoped against hope that a day would come when it would end up taking his life. Leto had conditioned his prescience in such a way that it never showed him the moment of his death, only events that threatened the golden path, and in doing this, he ensured that never again would humans become fodder for thinking machines the way they were before the Butlerian Jihad. So, he wasn't bothered by the fact that Ixians had designed entire chambers and ships that could hide whatever was within it from his prescient eye. These were called no chambers and no ships, and these technological advances proved crucial to the unraveling of the God Emperor's tyranny and the future of humanity going forward, because through the no ships, the Ixians revolutionized space travel once again. They developed thinking machines that were devoid of sentience but possessed the computational capacity of a guild navigator, thus making them a viable alternative for folding space. These navigation machines broke the Spacing Guild's monopoly over space travel for the first time in 14 millennia, and once that happened, things never went back to being the same for them. It wasn't like the Spacing Guild was wiped out of existence. Navigational no-ships were mostly taken by humans who fled the Old Imperium during the Scattering, never to return. Many of the residents of the Old Imperium who remained within its boundaries still used the Guild's services to traverse the stars, but with the fold space monopoly broken and spice supply at an all-time low, the Spacing Guild entered an inevitable period of decline. The God Emperor's death led to the creation of a new race of sandworms, which were more intelligent and thus more dangerous. Spice harvesting became even more life-threatening than it already was, making navigation machines all the more lucrative. To top it off, the Bene Tleilax managed to find a way to synthesize spice safely, but that secret was lost thanks to their war with the honored Matres. The Spacing Guild was forced to rely on the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood for its supply of pure spice in the final books of the Dune series because it was the witches who now controlled the worms. From this point on, everything should be taken with a hefty fistful of salt because it comes from the extended Dune-iverse, but the combination of navigational machines and the honored Matre's great enemy brought an end to the Spacing Guild as we knew it. The Guild Navigators' reliance on spice caused a rift between the Guild Navigators and administrators, with the latter wanting to restore their previous political and economic glory. Administrators were not afraid to suggest that perhaps navigation should be left to computers, and this was eventually exploited during Kralizak, the Typhoon struggle at the end of the universe. After the fall of Leto II, the Tleilaxu decided to stage a universal takeover by replacing all important officials in the Old Imperium with face dancers. Though they couldn't replace guild navigators given their biological mutations, they did replace every single administrator in the guild with face dancers to give them complete bureaucratic control. Except it turns out that these face dancers were under the command of another face dancer who worked for the thinking machine Omnius, and the reason it wanted the guild to convert to thinking machines was so that Omnius could take control of its space-folding technology. One of the final named steersmen of the Spacing Guild, another navigator called Edric, watched helplessly as his fellow navigators were killed and replaced by machines, and, in the end, his personal quest for regaining the spice flow turned out to be for nothing. After he lost all hope of restoring the guild to its glory from the days of the Carino Empire, Edric visited Junction, where he communed with a clear plas chamber flooded with nothing but melange gas. Turns out, this gas was none other than Norma Senva, who had transcended her physical form and become the mythical Oracle of Time. Yes, we know, it's the most deflating generic sci-fi transformation that Brian and Kevin could have given her, but it's what we've got, so we gotta deal with it. Norma told Edric that his concern over spice was trivial in the face of Kralizak, and she turned her entire family of navigators into humanity's first line of defense. The Spacing Guild took out the initial onslaught of Omnius's new machines as she confronted Omnius itself within the cathedral complex on Synchrony. As her family laid waste to the machines, Norma performed the final act of her life and transported the machine ruler to an alternate universe, traveling there with him to keep his threat contained for eternity. With that, the age of the Imperium and the Spacing Guild came to an end, and humanity entered a new era of human-machine codependency, with Duncan Idaho emerging as the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach. His merger with Erasmus marked the beginning of an age where all organic and inorganic things lived in harmony, and the need for a Spacing Guild was rendered moot.
We have just folded space from you.
Marvelous verdict! Though it's been sidelined in the eons preceding it, the Guild left an indelible mark on human history with its physics-altering discoveries and applications of the Holtzman effect. Our only regret in making this video is the fact that we don't have any new footage of these guys to show you because the Villeneuve Dune-iverse hasn't grown a set large enough to portray them. But with the Dune Messiah adaptation on its way, we can expect that to change pretty soon. Until then, we hope you enjoyed this detailed account of the Spacing Guild's 15,000-year history, which we've tried to make as accurate as we possibly could. Let us know your thoughts down in the comments section below because we can't wait to see what you guys have to say about everything we've just discussed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Dune content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Till then, take a note from the navigators and stay away from addictive substances because instant death is the least of your concerns if their fate is anything to go by. As always, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. This is Wizard Wheezy signing off for now, but you can always find me on Twitch. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.